Imagine boarding a flight, minding your own business, only to be accused, detained, and nearly thrown off the plane for no reason at all. But what if the man they tried to humiliate wasn't just any passenger? What if he was the one man who could bring their entire corrupt system crashing down? This is the story of power, revenge, and justice at 30,000 feet. Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The sun had barely begun to rise over Houston, casting long, golden streaks through the blinds of Wesley Boone's bedroom. He sat on the edge of his bed, rubbing his temple as he listened to the low hum of the city waking up outside. The distant sound of cars rolling down the freeway, the occasional bark of a dog, and the rhythmic chirping of early morning birds filled the air. It was a familiar symphony, one that had been playing for years, but today it felt different, heavily charged, as if something unseen was waiting just ahead. He reached for the worn leather watch sitting on his nightstand, fastening it onto his wrist with a quiet sigh. Another day, another flight. Wesley had traveled more times than he could count, yet something about this trip carried an unshakable weight. Maybe it was exhaustion creeping up on him after decades of service, or maybe it was the quiet unease that had settled in his gut ever since he'd received the briefing about the growing concerns within the airline industry. Either way, there was no time for second-guessing. He stood up, stretching his broad shoulders, then made his way into the kitchen. The smell of coffee lingered in the air from the automatic brew cycle he had set the night before. He poured himself a cup and leaned against the counter, letting the heat from the ceramic mug seep into his fingers. He had never been the type to dwell on things, but lately the past had been creeping up on him more often than he liked. His phone buzzed on the counter. "Morning, sir," came the voice of Carl Bishop, his former FBI colleague turned private investigator. "Got your itinerary for today. Everything's in order. Just a standard flight out to D.C.?" Wesley took a sip of his coffee before answering. "Yeah, nothing out of the ordinary. Just another day at the office." Carl exhaled through the receiver. "You sure about that? I saw a report about some pilot, Travis Whitmore. Name sound familiar?" Wesley frowned. "Can't say it does." "Well, keep an eye out. Looks like he's made the rounds before. Several complaints from passengers, most of them minorities claiming discriminatory treatment. Airlines swept it all under the rug, but it's starting to surface again." Wesley stared at the dark liquid swirling in his cup. "You think I should be worried?" Carl let out a short chuckle. "I think you're a grown man who can handle himself. But let's just say, if you do run into this guy, you might want to pay attention to how he operates." The call ended, and for a moment, Wesley simply stood there, absorbing the information. He had dealt with men like Whitmore before, small-minded individuals who wielded authority like a weapon, thinking it made them untouchable. He had spent his entire career dismantling those illusions. Setting his cup down, he grabbed his suitcase and double-checked his documents. No point overthinking. His job was simple: get to D.C., attend the meeting, and make sure policies were being upheld. This was what he did. Stepping out onto the front porch, he inhaled the crisp morning air. Houston always carried a certain warmth, even in the early hours. It reminded him of his childhood, of mornings spent listening to his father's radio while the world slowly came to life. With one last glance at the quiet street, he locked the door behind him and made his way to the waiting car. The airport was calling, and whatever awaited him there, he would handle it like he always did. The moment Wesley stepped into Oak Ridge International Airport, he could feel the familiar rush of controlled chaos. Business travelers in tailored suits hurried past, parents wrangled restless children, and announcements echoed through the terminals in a constant hum. It was a place where people were always moving, always in transit, yet somehow it felt like time stood still. He rolled his suitcase toward the check-in counter, handing his boarding pass to a young woman with dark curls tucked neatly into a bun. "Morning, sir. Flying first class to Washington, D.C.?" she asked, glancing at the screen. "That's right." She smiled, scanning his ID before returning it. "You're all set, Mr. Boone. Boarding begins in 30 minutes at Gate B12. With a nod of thanks, Wesley made his way towards security. He had done this process so many times it had become second nature. The routine of removing his belt, slipping off his shoes, placing his laptop into the bin. He barely paid attention as the TSA agent waved him through. Everything was going smoothly, until it wasn't. As Wesley walked toward the first-class lounge, he noticed a man in a pilot's uniform standing near the counter, talking to a flight attendant. The pilot was tall, with slick-back blonde hair and an air of self-importance that radiated from the way he held himself. His voice carried over the noise, sharp and laced with irritation. "Come on, you know how it is," the pilot scoffed, shaking his head. "They see first class on their ticket, and suddenly they think they belong there." The flight attendant shifted uncomfortably, glancing around before murmuring something Wesley couldn't hear. Then, as if sensing eyes on him, the pilot turned, and their gazes met. Something in the man's expression flickered, like recognition mixed with disdain. His lips curled slightly, his posture stiffening. Wesley didn't look away. He'd seen that expression before. The pilot's eyes dropped to the boarding pass in Wesley's hand, then to the first-class designation on his ticket. A slow smirk formed on his face, and he strode forward, casual but deliberate. "Sir, can I help you with something?" The tone was polite, but the edge beneath it was impossible to ignore. Wesley met his gaze evenly. "No, I don't believe you can." The pilot tilted his head, feigning curiosity. "Just making sure. First-class passengers board over there." He gestured toward the lounge, but the implication was clear. Wesley held up his ticket. "That's exactly where I'm headed." For a brief second, something unreadable flashed across the pilot's face. Irritation, maybe surprise. But it was gone just as quickly as it came. He let out a short chuckle, stepping aside. "Of course, enjoy your flight." Wesley didn't say another word as he walked past, but he could feel the man's gaze on his back the entire way. He had seen men like that before, too many times to count, and he knew one thing for certain: this wasn't over. Not yet. Wesley settled into one of the sleek leather chairs in the first-class lounge, his fingers drumming lightly on the armrest. The murmur of travelers, the clinking of glasses from the nearby bar, and the occasional hum of an intercom announcement filled the space. He wasn't the type to dwell on brief encounters, but something about that pilot lingered in his mind like a bad aftertaste. Travis Whitmore. He hadn't needed an introduction to know the type. Men like him didn't just exist in one industry, they were everywhere. They hid behind professionalism, behind forced smiles and polite words laced with subtle hostility. But Wesley had seen enough in his years of service to recognize a man who believed himself untouchable. Reaching for his phone, he scrolled through his messages, his eyes scanning for any updates from his office. But before he could type a reply, a shadow fell over his shoulder. "Excuse me, sir." Wesley looked up. A uniformed airport security officer stood beside him, expression unreadable, hands clasped in front of his utility belt. Another officer stood a few feet behind, gaze flicking between Wesley and the lounge entrance. "We need to ask you a few questions," the first officer continued, voice neutral but firm. Wesley set his phone down, taking his time before answering. "Regarding? There's been a report of suspicious behavior. Would you mind stepping aside with us?" For a moment, silence stretched between them. The weight of the words, the familiarity of the situation, pressed against his ribs like a slow, deliberate squeeze. He glanced around the lounge. People were watching now, some subtly, others not. A businessman in a gray suit stole glances over the top of his newspaper. A young couple nearby exchanged uneasy looks. Wesley exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. "Of course," he said, standing. He knew what this was. He knew exactly where it had started. As the officers led him out of the lounge, he didn't have to look back to know that Travis Whitmore was watching. The private security office smelled of stale coffee and industrial cleaner. Wesley sat on a metal chair, his posture relaxed but his mind razor-sharp, analyzing every detail. The officer across from him, a stocky man in his mid-50s with a name tag that read Torres, was scanning through a tablet, his expression unreadable. The second officer, a younger man in his early 30s, stood by the door, arms crossed. They weren't being aggressive, but Wesley could feel the unspoken tension in the air. Torres cleared his throat. "Mr. Boone, we received a report that you were attempting to access a restricted area of the airport." Wesley raised an eyebrow. "That's not possible. I went through standard security procedures and walked straight to the first-class lounge." Torres nodded but didn't look up. "The report states otherwise." Wesley exhaled through his nose, keeping his frustration in check. And who exactly submitted this report? The officer hesitated before setting the tablet down. A member of the flight crew said they saw you lingering near a restricted entryway. There it was. Wesley folded his arms. Let me guess. Captain Travis Whitmore? Neither officer answered. The younger one near the door shifted slightly. Look, Wesley continued, his voice calm but carrying weight. I have no interest in stepping anywhere I'm not supposed to be. I was heading to my gate. If Whitmore has an issue, it seems more personal than procedural. Torres let out a slow breath and leaned back. We did review some initial security footage. So far, we haven't seen anything that suggests you were in a restricted area. Wesley tilted his head. So why am I sitting here? Torres exchanged a glance with his colleague. Standard protocol. When a crew member reports a concern, we're required to follow up. Wesley let out a humorless chuckle. That's interesting, because I've handled enough cases like this to know that standard protocol rarely applies this quickly unless someone is pushing for it. Torres's lips pressed together. He knew Wesley wasn't wrong. Before anyone could speak, the door opened, and a woman in a navy blue airline uniform stepped inside. Sandra Ellison. Wesley had noticed her at the gate earlier. A flight attendant, probably mid-40s, sharp eyes, an air of professionalism that suggested she had seen too much, but still cared enough to do something about it. Excuse me, officer, Sandra said, standing with her back straight. I was informed that Mr. Boone was pulled in for questioning. I'd like to clarify something. Torres nodded. Go ahead. Sandra looked directly at Wesley. I was there the entire time. Mr. Boone never attempted to access any restricted areas. He was in the lounge minding his own business when Captain Whitmore approached him. Wesley didn't react, but inside something shifted. This was unexpected. Torres glanced between them, considering. Then he nodded. All right, I think we're done here. As the younger officer opened the door, Torres met Wesley's gaze. Sorry for the inconvenience. Wesley gave a slow nod, standing. He knew better than to think an apology erased what had just happened. As he stepped outside, Sandra fell in step beside him. He's not going to stop, she murmured under her breath. Wesley glanced at her. You know Whitmore? She let out a quiet scoff. Let's just say I've seen the way he operates. You should watch your back. Wesley exhaled, his jaw tightening slightly. He already was. Wesley walked through the terminal with measured steps, his suitcase rolling quietly behind him. The tension from the security office still clung to his skin, but he refused to let it show. He had been through this dance before, being singled out, questioned, made to feel like he didn't belong. But this time, it wasn't just about him. Sandra Ellison's words echoed in his head. He's not going to stop. He had no doubt she was right. Men like Travis Whitmore didn't know how to back down. They pushed until they got what they wanted. And right now, Wesley had a feeling he was about to see just how far Whitmore was willing to go. As he approached Gate B12, a familiar figure stood near the counter. Whitmore. He was talking to another pilot, arms crossed over his chest, his expression smug. When he spotted Wesley, a slow smirk crawled across his face. Wesley ignored him, walking straight to the boarding line. But before he could step forward, a gate agent, an older man with graying hair and a stiff posture, raised a hand. Excuse me, sir. There's been a change to your seat assignment. Wesley's fingers tightened around his suitcase handle. A change? Yes, the agent said, glancing at the computer screen. Your first-class seat has been reassigned. You'll now be seated in economy. A flicker of heat rose in Wesley's chest. He exhaled through his nose. And why is that? The agent hesitated. The captain made an adjustment to the seating arrangement. Your original seat was needed for another passenger. Wesley didn't have to look to know that Whitmore was watching. He could feel the pilot's eyes on him, waiting, expecting a reaction. He glanced at the screen. The flight was nearly full. Economy was packed. He had no doubt Whitmore had orchestrated this to make a point, humiliate him, remind him of his place. Wesley had spent years dismantling those kinds of power plays, and he wasn't about to start losing now. Calmly, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. I assume this change was documented. The agent blinked. Sir? I'll need a record of the reassignment, Wesley said smoothly. For my report. The agent's posture stiffened slightly. Your report? Wesley met his gaze evenly. Yes. Since this appears to be an unusual seating adjustment, I'll need documentation for the airline's compliance review board. A beat of silence. The agent's eyes flicked to Whitmore, who was still standing near the gate, pretending not to listen. The power shifted, just slightly. I, uh, Let me check something, the agent muttered, turning back to the computer. A minute later, he looked up, clearing his throat. My apologies, Mr. Boone. Your original seat is still available. It seems there was a mix-up. Wesley nodded, tucking his phone back into his pocket. Imagine that. Without another word, he stepped past the counter and into the jet bridge, feeling Whitmore's gaze burning into his back the entire way. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The cabin of the plane was quiet, save for the occasional rustling of newspapers and murmured conversations. Wesley settled into his first-class seat, glancing around as the final passengers boarded. The tension in his shoulders hadn't eased. If anything, it had sharpened. A moment later, a familiar voice cut through the hum of the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Travis Whitmore speaking. Wesley exhaled slowly, leaning back into his seat as the intercom crackled. We're expecting a smooth flight to Washington, D.C. today. Should be a little over 2.5 hours in the air. Sit back, relax, and we'll get you there safely. The words were professional, but there was something about the tone, something smug, something personal. Wesley glanced toward the front of the cabin, where Sandra Ellison was moving down the aisle. She caught his gaze briefly, but it was enough. There was something unsaid in her eyes. Then the flight attendant at the front stepped forward. Mr. Boone? He looked up. Yes? I'm sorry to disturb you, she said, hesitating, but I need to ask you to step into the galley for a moment. There it was. Wesley stood, ignoring the curious glances from nearby passengers. As he followed the flight attendant toward the front of the plane, he caught a glimpse of Whitmore just outside the cockpit door, watching. The galley was small, cramped. The flight attendant cleared her throat, shifting uncomfortably. I've been instructed to do another verification check on your boarding pass and ID. Wesley leaned against the narrow wall, crossing his arms. Let me guess. Captain Whitmore's orders? She didn't answer, but she didn't need to. Wesley let the silence stretch before he reached into his pocket, pulling out his wallet. He handed her his boarding pass and ID, watching as she looked them over, her expression tight. After a long pause, she exhaled, nodding slightly. Thank you, Mr. Boone. That will be all. Wesley took his documents back, but before he stepped away, he spoke, low enough that only she could hear. How long has he been doing this? The flight attendant hesitated, then looked away. Long enough. Wesley nodded once, his jaw tightening. Understood. As he stepped back into the cabin, he caught Sandra's gaze again. She had been watching. She gave him a single, knowing look, and that's when Wesley knew. She was about to make a choice. As the plane door sealed shut and the final announcements began, Wesley buckled his seatbelt, staring out the window as the aircraft taxied onto the runway. Whitmore thought he had control, but he had just overplayed his hand. The plane had been in the air for nearly an hour, cruising smoothly above the clouds. The cabin was quiet, save for the occasional clink of glasses as the flight attendants moved through first class, serving drinks. Wesley sat still, his fingers resting against the armrest, his mind running through every detail of what had happened so far. Whitmore had crossed the line. The seating reassignment, the security detainment, the mid-flight ID check. These weren't just isolated incidents. They were deliberate, calculated, a slow, methodical attempt to assert dominance, and yet Wesley knew something Whitmore didn't. Bullies always went too far. A soft voice pulled him from his thoughts. More coffee, Mr. Boone? He looked up to see Sandra Ellison standing beside him, a pot in her hand. He met her gaze. Please. She poured the coffee carefully, but there was a flicker of tension in her expression. A moment later, she set the pot aside and leaned in slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. You need to know something, she said. There's talk among the crew that Whitmore's been pushing for an emergency landing. Wesley's fingers tightened around his cup. An emergency landing? Why? Sandra's throat bobbed as she swallowed. Officially? He says there's a security concern. She hesitated. Unofficially? He wants you off this plane. A cold, slow burn settled in Wesley's chest. This wasn't just petty harassment anymore. This was something bigger. Whitmore was trying to get him off the aircraft. Mid-flight. "What's he claiming?" Wesley asked, his voice calm but firm. "He hasn't said yet. He's just building up to it." Sandra exhaled, glancing over her shoulder. "Some of us have flown with him before. He's done things like this. Small power plays. But this is different." Wesley studied her. "Why are you telling me this?" Sandra let out a short breath, shaking her head. "Because it's wrong. And because I'm done staying quiet." That was all he needed to hear. Wesley took a sip of his coffee, his mind already shifting gears. If Whitmore was planning to fabricate a reason to land the plane early, he had to be stopped before it got that far. He set his cup down, wiped his hands on a napkin, and calmly unbuckled his seatbelt. It was time to take control of the situation. Wesley moved with purpose, walking down the narrow aisle toward the galley near the cockpit. The quiet hum of the engines filled the space, but behind that, he could sense the tension thickening. Sandra followed close behind, but before they reached the cockpit door, another voice cut through the air. "Mr. Boone." Wesley turned. A flight attendant stood blocking the aisle. A younger man, tense, unsure. "The captain has asked that you return to your seat," he said stiffly. Wesley tilted his head slightly. "Did he now?" The attendant swallowed. "Yes, sir. He said he'll be making an announcement shortly." Sandra stepped forward, her voice sharp. "So he hasn't actually declared an emergency?" The attendant hesitated, glancing toward the cockpit. "Not yet." Wesley folded his arms. "Then I'd like to speak with him." The young man hesitated before finally turning and speaking into the intercom. "Captain Whitmore, Mr. Boone has requested a word." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the cockpit door cracked open just slightly, and a voice, calm, controlled, drifted out. "There's nothing to discuss. Mr. Boone needs to take his seat." Wesley took a slow step forward. "Is that an order, Captain?" Silence. Then the door opened fully. Whitmore stood there, his expression neutral, but his eyes burned with something dangerous. "We have a situation developing," Whitmore said, his tone smooth. "I was going to handle this privately, but since you're so eager to talk, why don't we discuss it here?" Wesley didn't flinch. "By all means." Whitmore exhaled through his nose, then turned to the flight attendants. "We have reason to believe that a passenger on board may have used a falsified ID to board this aircraft." The words landed like a stone in the pit of Wesley's stomach. Not because they were true, but because of how perfectly designed they were. A falsified ID. It was vague, hard to disprove in the moment, just enough to create doubt. Sandra stiffened. "That's a lie." Whitmore ignored her. He looked directly at Wesley. "You're a federal employee, correct?" Wesley nodded once. Whitmore smiled, just slightly. "Then you understand why this has to be taken seriously." Wesley studied him. He could feel the trap tightening around him. If Whitmore declared an emergency, the plane would have to land early. Security would meet them on the ground. They'd detain Wesley, at least temporarily, and by the time they sorted out, the damage to his reputation would already be done. But Whitmore had made a mistake. He had assumed Wesley would fight back the way he expected, angrily, defensively. Instead, Wesley did something else entirely. He smiled. "Of course," Wesley said smoothly. "Let's verify my credentials then." Whitmore hesitated, clearly not expecting that response. Wesley pulled out his ID and boarding pass, holding them up. "Go ahead. Call your airline security desk. Call the TSA. Call federal law enforcement, for that matter. I'll wait." A muscle ticked in Whitmore's jaw. The thing about bullies was, they relied on intimidation. They wanted their target to react emotionally, to panic, to fight back in a way that would justify their attack. But Wesley wasn't giving him that satisfaction. After a long pause, Whitmore's expression darkened. "That won't be necessary." "Won't it?" Wesley asked. "Because I'd hate for you to neglect protocol, Captain." More silence. Then Whitmore turned to the young flight attendant. "Tell air traffic control that we'll proceed to Washington as scheduled." The tension in the cabin broke, just slightly. Wesley didn't move. He watched as Whitmore stepped back into the cockpit and closed the door. Hard. Sandra let out a quiet breath. I can't believe that worked. Wesley adjusted his cufflinks, then turned to head back to his seat. Like I said, he murmured, bullies always go too far. The rest of the flight continued in tense silence. Whitmore had backed down for now, but Wesley knew men like him didn't let things go. The pilot had been forced to retreat in front of his crew and passengers, and that kind of humiliation wasn't something he'd forget easily. Wesley sat back in his seat, fingers lightly tapping against the armrest. He watched the flight attendants move through the aisles, the quiet hum of the engines providing a steady backdrop. Sandra passed by once, briefly making eye contact. She didn't say anything, but there was something unspoken in her gaze, a mixture of relief and apprehension. The intercom crackled. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our initial descent into Washington, D.C. Weather conditions are clear, and we're expecting an on-time arrival. Whitmore's voice was even, controlled. If you didn't know better, you'd think nothing had happened. But Wesley knew better. As the flight attendants made their final rounds, Wesley reached for his phone and checked the signal. Still nothing. Airplane mode. He'd have to wait until they landed to contact Carl Bishop and let him know what had gone down. But something told him that by the time he touched the ground, Whitmore would already be making his next move. The moment Wesley stepped off the plane and into the terminal, he knew something was wrong. Two uniformed airport police officers stood near the gate, their eyes scanning the passengers. And then, their gaze landed on him. Sandra stepped up beside him, her voice low. Something's off. Wesley kept his face neutral as the officers approached. One of them, a tall man with graying hair, offered a tight-lipped smile. Mr. Boone? Wesley stopped, setting his carry-on bag down deliberately. That's me. The officer nodded. We'd like to ask you a few questions. Wesley didn't react immediately. He was aware of the eyes on him. Other passengers pausing, watching, waiting. What's this about? He asked, his voice calm. The second officer, younger, shifted slightly. We received a report about a security concern on your flight. There it was. Wesley exhaled slowly, glancing at Sandra. She looked furious, but she didn't speak. I see, Wesley said, his expression unreadable. And who exactly submitted this report? The older officer hesitated. That information isn't something we can disclose at this time. Of course not. Wesley already knew the answer. He adjusted his suit jacket and glanced past them, where, sure enough, Travis Whitmore stood a short distance away, watching. The pilot wasn't smirking this time. His face was unreadable, but his eyes, triumphant. Whitmore had lost the battle in the air, so he had brought the war to the ground. Wesley rolled his shoulders back and let out a slow breath. He had spent his entire career preparing for moments like this, and he wasn't about to lose now. Wesley had been in enough high-stakes situations to know that the moment you react the way they expect, you've already lost. So instead of protesting or demanding answers, he simply nodded and gestured toward the officers. Lead the way. The older officer hesitated, clearly expecting resistance. You're not going to ask why? Wesley gave him a small, measured smile. Oh, I already know why. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Whitmore shift slightly, a flicker of unease crossing the pilot's face. Good. The officers escorted him toward a private security office just off the main terminal. Sandra started to follow, but Wesley turned slightly, shaking his head. No, he said quietly. Stay out here. Watch her brows furrowed, but she nodded. Inside, the room was sterile. Gray walls, a desk, 2 chairs, a camera in the upper corner. Wesley sat down, adjusting his sleeves as the officers settled in across from him. The older officer, whose badge read, Lieutenant Marcus Grayson, folded his hands on the table. Mr. Boone, we received a report that you may have presented falsified identification while boarding your flight. Wesley exhaled through his nose. Whitmore really was going all in. He didn't react. I see. And did you verify that claim before detaining me? The younger officer, a man who looked barely 30, shifted uncomfortably. He knew this was wrong. Grayson, however, remained stone-faced. We are following standard procedures. Wesley held his gaze. Then I assume you've already contacted the Federal Bureau of Security Affairs. Grayson's jaw ticked slightly. He hadn't expected that. Wesley leaned forward, clasping his hands together. Because if you had, They'd tell you exactly who I am. And then you'd realize that the only thing you're doing here is making yourself part of someone else's problem. The younger officer cleared his throat. We, haven't contacted federal security yet. Wesley smiled. You should. Grayson hesitated, but after a long pause, he sighed. Stay here. He motioned for the younger officer to follow him out of the room. Wesley sat back, exhaling slowly. He could feel the pieces moving now. Whitmore had overplayed his hand, and soon he'd realize that he wasn't the only one who knew how to use the system to his advantage. It didn't take long. Wesley had barely finished scanning the room when the door burst open again. Only this time, the energy had completely shifted. Grayson looked irritated. The younger officer looked outright nervous. You're free to go, Grayson said stiffly. Wesley raised an eyebrow. That fast? Grayson's jaw tightened. Your credentials have been verified. There was a misunderstanding. A slow, knowing smile spread across Wesley's face. Imagine that. He stood up, buttoning his jacket, taking his time. He knew what had happened. Carl Bishop must have picked up the phone the second Wesley's name hit the system. The moment federal security got involved, the airport authorities had been forced to back off. Wesley walked past them, but before stepping out the door, he turned slightly. I'd advise your department to be careful about whose word you take at face value. Grayson's lips thinned, but he didn't say anything. Wesley didn't look back. The moment he stepped out of the office, Sandra was waiting. That was fast. He nodded. Faster than Whitmore expected. She exhaled, glancing toward the terminal exit. He's gone. Wesley wasn't surprised. Whitmore had played his hand and lost. For now. But this wasn't over. As Wesley pulled out his phone to call Carl, his mind was already moving forward. If Whitmore was willing to go this far, what else was he hiding? It was time to find out. Wesley walked through the airport terminal, his phone pressed to his ear as he waited for Carl Bishop to pick up. His mind was already running through the next steps. Whitmore had crossed a line, and that meant one thing. He had something to lose. The call connected. Boone, Carl's gruff voice came through, laced with curiosity. I just got a notification that you were flagged at the airport. What the hell happened? Whitmore, Wesley said simply. Carl let out a sharp breath. I figured as much. He tried to have you detained? He did more than try, Wesley said, stepping out into the crisp Washington air. He fabricated a security concern and got airport police involved. If I hadn't pushed back, they would have grounded me for hours. Carl was silent for a moment. Then, that's bold, even for a guy like him. Exactly. Wesley stopped near the curb, watching as taxis and black SUVs lined up for arriving passengers. This isn't just about me. He's covering something. Carl exhaled. All right, I'll dig. Whitmore's name has come up before. Passenger complaints, rumors about how he treats certain employees, but nothing that stuck. If he's pulling a stunt like this, he's desperate. Wesley nodded. Check if there's anything tying him to upper management at Skyglide. A pilot doesn't pull this kind of power play unless he knows someone's got his back. Carl grunted. You think he's part of something bigger? I think, Wesley said, his voice calm but firm, that I just became his biggest problem. Carl chuckled. All right, Boone. I'll get back to you soon. The call ended. Wesley slipped his phone into his pocket and hailed a cab. This wasn't over. Not even close. Whitmore had made his move. Now it was Wesley's turn. Carl Bishop wasn't a man who wasted time. By the time Wesley reached his hotel, a text was already waiting for him. Found something. Call me. Wesley shut the door behind him and dialed. Carl picked up instantly. Boone, you were right. Whitmore isn't acting alone. Wesley moved to the window, staring out over the DC skyline. Go on, Carl exhaled. I pulled his records. Nothing on paper screams problem, but you know what does? The complaints that disappeared. Wesley's grip on the phone tightened. Disappeared? Yeah. More than a dozen reports over the past 5 years. Passenger discrimination complaints, reports from junior flight crew about his behavior. Every single one of them was either dismissed or mysteriously resolved. That doesn't happen by accident. No, it doesn't, Carl agreed. And get this. Guess who's been signing off on those dismissals? A pause. Then Carl dropped the name. Philip Grayson. the same airport security official who had detained Wesley earlier that day. Wesley's jaw tightened. That changed everything. Grayson's not just airport security, Carl continued. He's a former Skyglide executive, moved into this role a few years ago, but he's still got deep ties to the airline. Wesley exhaled slowly. Now it made sense. Whitmore wasn't just some rogue pilot with a grudge. He was being protected. By the time Wesley spoke again, his voice was steady. "We need proof," Carl grunted. "Already working on it. But Boone, be careful. If Grayson is covering for Whitmore, this goes higher than just one bad pilot." "I know," Wesley said, and he intended to bring all of them down. The next morning, Wesley sat in the corner of a quiet DC cafe, his eyes scanning through the files Carl had sent over. Page after page of buried complaints, silenced reports, and mysteriously dropped investigations. Whitmore wasn't just an arrogant pilot with a superiority complex. He was a protected asset, and Philip Grayson was his shield. Wesley took a sip of his coffee, his mind already working through the next step. If Grayson had been sweeping Whitmore's misconduct under the rug for years, that meant Skyglide Airways was complicit. His phone vibrated. "Sandra," he answered immediately. "Talk to me." Her voice was hushed but urgent. "I think Whitmore knows something's up." Wesley's grip on his coffee cup tightened. "Why?" "Because he's covering his tracks. I overheard a senior pilot say Whitmore's been reassigned, transferred to another base, supposedly for administrative review. But that's not how this works, Boone. When a pilot's under investigation, they don't move them. They ground them." Wesley exhaled. "They're trying to keep him out of the spotlight." "Exactly," Sandra said. "And there's more. I talked to one of the flight attendants who filed a complaint against him a few years ago. She told me she got a payout and an NDA, which means Skyglide knew what he was doing," Wesley murmured. Sandra hesitated. "Look, I don't know how deep this goes, but you need to move fast. They're trying to erase the trail." Wesley nodded. "I'll handle it." He ended the call and immediately dialed Carl. The ex-FBI agent answered on the second ring. "What now?" "They're moving Whitmore, trying to make him disappear," Wesley said. "We need to go public before they have the chance to bury this." Carl let out a low chuckle. "Good thing I already called in a favor. There's a reporter, Ava Mitchell. She's been looking into Skyglide for months but never had a solid lead." "She does now," Wesley said. Carl sighed. "You sure you want to go this route? Once this goes public, there's no walking it back." Wesley's jaw tightened. "That's the point." A pause, then Carl chuckled again. "All right, Boone, let's burn this thing down." The story broke less than 24 hours later. Ava Mitchell's article didn't just expose Whitmore. It ripped the entire corrupt system at Skyglide Airways wide open. The headlines were everywhere. Airline cover-up? Pilot accused of discrimination? Protected for years. FAA launches investigation into Skyglide Airways, following whistleblower report. Who's responsible? Former Skyglide executive linked to buried complaints. The fallout was immediate. Philip Grayson was suspended pending investigation. Skyglide Airways issued a weak public statement claiming they took all allegations seriously, but it wasn't enough. The FAA announced a full-scale probe into the airline's policies. And Travis Whitmore? He was fired. But that wasn't the real victory. The real victory was the change. Whistleblowers within Skyglide started coming forward. More pilots, more flight attendants, more employees who had been silenced. And at the center of it all, Wesley Boone stood unshaken. He had seen it before. Powerful men thinking they were untouchable. But in the end, the truth always won. As he walked through the airport a week later, this time, no one stopped him. No questioning, no power plays, just quiet respect. As it should be. He boarded his flight, settled into his seat, and looked out the window as the plane lifted into the sky. This battle was over, but the fight for justice never ended. At the end of the day, power is only as strong as the silence that protects it. But when the truth is exposed, even the most untouchable figures can fall. Wesley Boone didn't just fight for himself. He fought for every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. So what do you think? Have you ever witnessed or experienced injustice like this? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you don't want to miss our next gripping story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Justice never sleeps, and neither do we. See you in the next one.